Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's Fireside Chat. I'm your host. My guest today is Nell Newman, the CEO of Newman Strategic. Nell is an internationally recognized expert in corporate sustainability, and she's a leading voice on how companies can tackle some of the world's most complex issues while simultaneously driving profitable growth. She has been ranked among the most influential people in business and sustainability by an association of sustainability professionals. She was featured in Forbes as one of the 50 women to watch in 2020. And in 2021, she was named one of the most powerful women in corporate America by the same publication. Her new book, The ESG Advantage: Why Business Leaders Must Not Just Resist the Anti-ESG Movement, but Lead the Way, was just released by Harvard Business Review Press. It's one of the must-reads for anyone looking to understand the current attacks against ESG and why companies must resist them. Thank you for joining me for this fireside chat. Let's dive right in. All right, Nell, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me here today. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. So, let's start with the title of your book. So many companies are giving into the anti-ESG movement. So why do they do that? Why do you say that business leaders must resist it? What's your thesis? Well, my thesis is that when we see companies pulling back from their commitments to ESG or environmental, social, and governance investing, which is becoming more and more prevalent when we see that happening, what we're seeing is a misdiagnosis of what the issue is. What we're seeing is a failure to recognize that there really is no meaningful difference between ESG and good business. When we pull back from addressing climate change, when we pull back from diversity, equity, and inclusion, when we pull back from human rights due diligence, these are not somebody else's problems to solve. These are our problems to solve. And ultimately, when we take these issues seriously and we integrate them into our strategy and operations, we end up creating better businesses. And when we step away from those issues, what we end up doing is creating worse businesses that don't stand the test of time. You make an excellent point, and it's especially important in today's environment where we have a lot of activist investors pushing back on ESG. Can you help us understand who exactly is behind this anti-ESG movement? Yeah, sure. So we've got multiple constituencies that are pushing back on ESG. We've got fossil fuel interests that are pushing back on climate action. We've got conservative politicians and groups that are pushing back on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've got all sorts of folks that are pushing back on the idea of businesses taking a stand on any of these issues. But ultimately, if we look at who is going to benefit from these companies backing away from these issues, it's the shareholders, the same shareholders that are pushing them to do that. They're pushing them to pollute more. They're pushing them to be less inclusive. They're pushing them to do things that are ultimately bad for society, bad for the planet, and ultimately destructive to the company over time. You talk about the importance of understanding the real beneficiaries of the anti-ESG movement. Do you have any examples of companies that have gone too far in their commitment to ESG? You mentioned some companies that maybe didn't go far enough, but are there companies that have gone too far? I think the key to answering that question is recognizing that when we talk about ESG, we're talking about a set of principles that are aspirational. And that means that every company is always going to be moving towards this ideal. And there's never going to be a company that's, quote, too green, that's too diverse, that's too equitable. So I wouldn't suggest that there's ever a company that's gone too far. The question is, are you going far enough? Are you going fast enough? And frankly, are you taking this seriously enough as an integrated part of your strategy? Let's come back to that point about speed. Speed matters because the challenges that we're facing, whether it's climate change, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's a supply chain disruption, these are all existential challenges to our companies. And so the idea that we should slow down on addressing these issues, it seems to me, is precisely the wrong answer. In your book, you cite several CEOs that you've worked with closely. Who are some of the best examples of companies that have done a great job integrating ESG into their strategy? Well, Larry Fink at BlackRock has talked very openly about his journey on this. He has said that it was naive to think that capitalism could solve all of society's problems. And he's increasingly recognizing that we need to take these issues seriously as investors. And so I think he's somebody who's LED by example in terms of thinking about how do we rethink the role of business in society. Paul Pullman at Unilever is somebody who has also been very public in saying that he has recognized that we need to rethink the role of business in society, that sustainability and business are inextricably linked, that what's good for society is good for business. He's another example of somebody who's really stepped forward and LED by example. In the book, you talk about the different types of companies, the laggards versus the leaders. Can you give us an example of a company that is a laggard and a leader in terms of their approach to ESG? Sure. Well, let's take Exxon. Exxon has been a laggard on climate for decades. They have fought tooth and nail to deny the science around climate change. They have fought tooth and nail to resist any effort to put a price on carbon. They have resisted renewable energy investments. And we're starting to see the consequences of that. Their stock price is down more than 30% over the last decade. When oil and gas prices have gone up dramatically, they're underperforming their peers. They're underperforming the broader market. And ultimately, their business model is one that is going to become more and more difficult to sustain over time. And then let's take a company like Equinor, which was formerly known as Statoil. Equinor has made a very public commitment to invest in renewables. They have made a very public commitment to reduce their own emissions. They have made a very public commitment to divest from fossil fuels. And what we're seeing is that their stock price has outperformed their peers, that their stock price has outperformed the broader market over the last 5 years. And ultimately, they're seen as a company that is poised for growth in the future because they're taking these issues seriously. You make a compelling case that ESG is simply good business. Yet companies are still struggling to measure the impact of their ESG efforts on their financial performance. How do we close that gap? Well, I think that when we're talking about measuring the impact of ESG on financial performance, we have to break that up into two separate questions. One is, how do we measure the impact of ESG integration on financial performance? And the second is, how do we measure the impact of ESG issues on financial performance? Those are two different questions, and I think often when companies are thinking about this, they're conflating those two issues. So when we're talking about ESG integration, that is something that is baked into strategy and operations. It's not something that sits over there as a separate initiative. And so you're going to find that reflected in the way that you run your business. You're going to find that reflected in the way that you think about capital allocation. And so ultimately, it's going to show up in your financial statements. And that is a measurement issue. That's an accounting issue. That's an issue of transparency and disclosure. And we have tools to address that. We have frameworks to address that. What we need is more widespread adoption of those tools and frameworks. When we're talking about measuring the impact of specific ESG issues on financial performance, there is a relationship there, but it's not a simple one. And that's because when we're talking about issues like climate change, we're talking about issues like human rights. We're talking about issues like corruption. These are systemic issues. And when you put in place safeguards to protect against those issues, you are protecting against risks. And so when we're thinking about the impact of ESG issues on financial performance, we're really thinking about risk. And there are tools and frameworks to help us measure that as well. But again, what we need is more widespread adoption of those tools and frameworks. Do you believe that companies are making progress on ESG? And if so, what are some of the examples of that progress? I definitely think that companies are making progress on ESG. I think the vast majority of companies are taking these issues seriously. I think that when we see backsliding, what we're seeing is either a company that is inexperienced and does not yet know how to navigate these issues effectively, or a company that is being pushed by short-term focused shareholders to back away from these issues. I think fundamentally when we look at companies over time, companies that take these issues seriously tend to outperform over the long term. And when we see companies that back away from these issues, they tend to be the ones that ultimately get left behind. So what can business leaders do to better navigate this complex ESG landscape? Well, I think the most important thing they can do is take these issues seriously, recognize that these are not somebody else's problem to solve, these are our problems to solve. Recognize that there's no meaningful difference between ESG and good business, and then put in place the systems and processes that will allow them to integrate ESG into strategy and operations. And that starts with recognizing that ESG issues cut across every aspect of your business, that they're not somebody else's problem to solve. So the CEO has to take these issues seriously. The board has to take these issues seriously. Every function within the company has to take these issues seriously, and we have to integrate them into everything that we do. Well, Nell, thank you so much for joining me here today and sharing your insights on such an important topic. It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Thank you for watching this week's Fireside Chat. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to our channel for upcoming Fireside Chats. And to learn more about our programming, please visit our website,